Welcome everyone to the Genie Seminar. This is May the 6th, and we're continuing in our series. We were chatting at the last meeting about some action steps, but Sherrod had brought up that when we were identifying our 7+2 word switches, that we didn't have many people on for the Sunday that was Easter. We only had, I think, 3 or 4 people suggested we ought to redo this word switch again if these are going to be used at future times for other people. So we'll start with this, and then we'll have some discussion and also try to continue with this issue about action steps. So we're going to turn on our recording by Brad Shepard of the 6 of the 7 life-changing, world-saving, mind-freeing word switches that we've identified them, and then I'll introduce a new member, Kate. So would you start the recording now?
The recording, I should have just start the
video.
Oh, sorry. I forgot the share computer sound.
Welcome back to the educational community strands on making our life more wonderful. You are now at strand 6, module 2 of the 7 critical, mind-freeing, life-changing, world-saving word switches. It is called the Energy for Anger and Anxiety word switch. We are wise to identify the sudden arousal our body generates in response to a challenge as energy for problem solving instead of anger or anxiety. That is the instinctive emergency need for fight or flight that was appropriate in our ancestors' savage environment. Directing our energy to mental problem solving is far more likely to bring about our preferred outcome than acts that often follow anger or anxiety. Too often, when we turn our energy into physical aggression or avoidance, we instinctively react to events with a mindless behavior that gets us into deep trouble. We are prone to regret the instinctive automatic reaction to a stressful situation act before we think of the short and long-term consequences of our response.
Welcome to strand number 13. Today's strand, substituting the word energy for anger and anxiety. And the next strand are word switch numbers 6 and 7 of the 7 mind-freeing, life-changing, world-saving word switches. They comprise the 2 important word switches that dramatically prevent major problems we bring on ourselves. I'm referring to the mindless, impulsive, harmful aggression that was appropriate for our ancestors, but commonly results in irreversible consequences and punishment in today's relatively civilized world. We commonly observe road rage and other rages, crimes of passion, and related impulsive behaviors triggered by a stressful event. Our primitive fight or flight behavior, the root of this problem, is hardwired in the first to develop older portion of our brain. Here is today's strand. Substitute, when possible, the word switch energy for the trigger words anger and anxiety. Some years ago, I was invited by the Connecticut Commissioner of Mental Health to interview, along with the Commissioner of Corrections, inmates serving the longest sentences in our highest security prison. I was struck by the high percentage of individuals who had lost their freedom because of a single destructive act committed in a fit of rage, often an act of passion. Even though their mindless crime was an atypical deviation from their usual behavior, they could not undo their damage. Have you witnessed the many kinds of rage that lead to explosive behavior? Can you recount personal experiences where you reacted to anger or to a stressful situation by taking actions that you now wish you could have handled more productively? We all start life hardwired to release energy chemicals in response to stressful situations. instinctive survival of the fittest, and fight or flight primitive physical responses alert us to take quick action. Our ancestors lived in a world where survival depended on instant action. Each turn at every corner required anticipation of what danger lurked beyond. Survival required being on red alert status and being prepared to strike out or run away. In either response, emergency production of energy was required. Second mistakes are rarely permitted in life-threatening circumstances. This elegant emergency response system, designed by nature, allowed our ancestors to survive and thrive in a primitive, savage environment. Constant preparedness for red alert emergency was once critical. The words anger and anxiety trigger the physical confrontation or emergency flight our ancestors required to survive. Preoccupation with survival explains why humor is not a characteristic of animals and was unknown to our primitive ancestors. Sophisticated, common sense, long-term problem-solving, and laughter are learned with the help of language. In today's partially civilized world, we no longer face a life-threatening situation at every turn or corner, rarely at any corner. When we experience the frustrations that are a common part of daily living, our body still responds by producing instant changes in our chemistry and red alert tension telling us to take action. We are all born with elegant physical solutions to survive and thrive. We are pre-programmed to automatically repeat the life cycle, to direct our energy to eat and not be eaten, and to procreate. 30-year mortgages, planning a proper retirement, an eternal hereafter, and preserving the global community were not priorities of our early ancestors. Surviving and thriving today is best accomplished directing our energy to elegant, common sense, mental problem solving. Fighting or running in a relatively civilized world usually gets us what we don't want rather than what we prefer. Technology has suddenly shrunk our world so that geography no longer separates us from other tribes. So we must learn to collaborate with our new neighbors to accomplish our shared interests, not fight or intimidate others to prove our dominance. We must also plan for the long-term as well as the short-term solutions that preoccupied our ancestors. Cooperation and collaboration for mutual benefit is now required to survive and thrive. Anger is an appropriate trigger word to activate the fight response. Anxiety is an appropriate trigger word to activate the flight response. Run or hide. Labeling our automatic chemical response to stress energy is more likely to turn on a mental problem-solving action pathway than a physical fight or flight action pathway. Energy is a more neutral and accurate trigger word than anger or anxiety. Common sense logical problem solving is our means to create wisdom-inspired solutions that benefit all parties and secure future benefits in addition to immediate short-term benefits. The simple word switch energy reroutes our thinking to replace our automatic negative fight or flight action pathways that are no longer adaptive. Problem-solving thinking is now the appropriate substitute for hair-trigger physical reaction. It signals us to apply common sense to plan beneficial action. Physically fighting or running and hiding provide limited short-term benefit given today's social expectations. Most people continue to label the problem-solving energy produced by stress with traditional trigger words such as anger and anxiety. These labels turn on not only the primitive physical behaviors of fight and flight, but also many modern-day harmful mental equivalents of these behaviors. These negative reactions include blaming others, blaming ourselves through put-downs and guilt, and avoidance behaviors such as procrastination, lying, substance abuse, changing jobs, residences, and spouses. Worry is sustained pink alert thinking. We what if and then anticipate the worst outcome of a situation to the neglect of what is the most likely or the best outcome. When individuals become excessively anxious about anxiety, they multiply its effect. Common outcomes are panic and phobias to some real or imaginary feared situation. Sustained tension leads to muscle contraction pain in the tensed area, such as headache, backache, neck and jaw pain. Getting rid of these negative patterns will be discussed in future strands. The energy word switch provided in this strand and the next strand effectively prevent the instinctive, primitive behaviors that are commonly triggered by our emergency response system and can cause great harm. Each of the prevention word switches is easy to learn. With a bit of patience and mental rehearsal, they will come habitual and effortless and enhance instinct and tradition with common sense wisdom.
Okay, that was Brad Shepard again, expressing one of the 6 word changes, these simple word changes that elevate the way we think from our animal brain to our higher level brain, and we can discuss these in just a moment. And I just wanted to welcome Kate to join our meeting today. Maybe you could say a word or two about yourself, Kate. You have to unmute yourself.
Good morning, all. Good morning, all. My name is Kathy Roberts, or they call me Kate, and I live up here in South Dakota. I'm in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I met Don. I've kind of been on some Good of the Whole calls, and then through Nina Patrick and this co-creators convergence, I've run into this gentleman, and you know, I know we're all looking for more compassionate governance, and I feel his World Peace Academy, I just see him as this wise grandfather that can lead us into new ways of being, and so I'm a fan, and he invited me, and I'm here, and I'm honored to be in circle with all of you.
Hi, welcome.
Welcome.
Yeah, welcome, Kate.
So maybe just a very quick introduction, just to say your name and how you're related to the meeting. We'll go around. Why don't you start, Pacey?
I'm Pacey. I'm Don and Marilyn's middle son, actually their favorite son, and I'm just come to the meetings, trying to work with everybody, learn.
Yeah, I'm Abby. I'm Don and Marilyn's oldest son, and really their favorite son when the other son's not around. That's what they tell me. So, welcome, Kate.
And I'm John Rosato. I'm a brother from a different mother, and I'm good friends with Pacey and Abby and the family. And just welcome, Kate. You've joined a fantastic group here.
Hi, I'm Pearl Podrove, and I'm an old friend of Don and Marilyn, and very interested in listening and learning from these meetings, and a warm welcome to you, Kate.
I'm Marilyn. I'm the mother of the 2 boys who both think they're our favorites. I think that's pretty good if the parents can work that out. So hello.
Hi, I'm Sharath. I am a friend of Don, although we have differences a lot, but I think I am also a fan of Don like you, and he has been a great influence in my life for past 7 years.
Basu, you want to just introduce yourself?
I think Basu is
muted.
Okay, Basu, by the way, is in India. I'll just say that Basu is Basu, you're muted. So if we can't hear you. But I just mentioned that you has been working with us for a long time and helping us with our computer programs and websites, and represents part of our Indian population as well. So welcome. Let's get back now to our our word switch for today, just as an introduction again for Kate, that everybody can speak for 2 minutes in these meetings, and then the other try to speak to the topic. And we're not interested in crosstalk. Nobody is right or wrong in these meetings. We're just simply sharing our personal views and trying to co-create answers to the most important questions what we have if we're going to survive and thrive. And part of the basis of these meetings is, again, we remind ourselves, is that Einstein, one of our brightest minds, told us it's only a matter of time before someone or tribes will proliferate weapons with ultimate destructive power and will end civilization as we know it unless we teach ourselves a newer way of thinking. And this part of this, he also told us what I think is his most brilliant insight, is that we can prevent that. There's the one way that we can prevent that predictable catastrophe is if we can teach ourselves a newer way of thinking where we cooperate instead of compete for benefits. That as the world becomes now interconnected into one large whole, we're no longer living as we did for our ancestors in 1 billion years in separate environments where we were uncivilized and we were competing for limited food and limited resources. So the issue now is if we can teach ourselves to cooperate instead of compete for dominance, but we're still operating on our animal brain. We're still operating on the way we have been thinking for over 1 billion years, the way animals think. And the purpose of our meetings is to co-create answers to one of the most basic issues is why do we fill our world with fear, hate, scarcity, and war when what we really want and need is happiness, enough, love, and peace? So that's just one of the questions, but we have many kinds of questions. And the idea of our Genie group is that this is a newer method of education, which is from bottom up, where we share our genius together by learning together, instead of a top-down method where somebody, a professor or God or whoever we think of knows all the answers, tells us what's right, and then we follow that pattern. So we're developing this as a newer way of thinking. And we've had at least asserting that 7 simple word changes can elevate the way we think from our animal brain to our human puzzle-solving brain. And there are 2 love creation skills that are relatively secret that teach us to love ourselves with the abundance that overflows to enrich the world. And if we can achieve these things, then we can spread our word and develop a newer method. Part of my intent here is that we can become somewhat like Alcoholics Anonymous as a model, where a couple of drunk individuals started a particular way of learning, the Alcoholic Anonymous meeting, and those meetings have the 12 steps. We're introducing the collective wisdoms of brilliant people in these meetings to answer important questions. So that's our background, and just a reminder, today we're looking at, we leave one of the words out because it's not, the words we've been using are anxiety, fear, and anger. We mentioned just 2 of the words, but we're used to, when we get frustrated, our body tells us we're anxious, and we have anxiety and fear, and those words lead to behavior that is fight or flight. And usually fighting was the normal way of dealing with things, or running and hiding. Today's world, what's different that we don't recognize is that if we continue to fight with our new weapons, then the war will be over in 2 to 15 or 30 minutes, depending on where these bombs are released from. If it's off of a submarine, then it's 2 minutes to reach most major places. If it's from across the sea, people say it takes about 15 minutes. But the answer, as Einstein said, if we can teach ourselves a newer way of thinking. So I'm going to pass the talking stick now over to anyone who would like to share their ideas. The issue of, we learn to think by common sense, by, as Barbara Marx Hubbard has said, one of my teachers, by choice rather than chance. Rather than chance evolution, can we put our heads together and answer a question like, how can we how can we take some action, or what action can we take that can make a difference? Point. Think about the times that you acted on impulse and did something you regretted. You ever talked to you regretted or did something that, that would have been better if you could have thought about it?
I mean, road rage is a perfect example of, you know, you're in the confines of your car and somebody does something that, you know, really torques you off, and you react poorly. Marcella, my wife, reminds me maybe too often when that occurs to, you know, just let it go. I mean, okay, person did this or that, let it go. Or someone's following very closely behind you, and it's, you know, it's annoying. Those are, because in the big scheme of things, it's really not important, and it's easy. It's better to just let it go and just think of, you know, a better way to use your energy, rather than getting angry and doing something like, you know, reacting to that person. So that's one, you know, example probably everybody has come across in one time or another if you drive a lot.
Now remember, John is the first one who brought up the wife thing. So as I get into this, I'm just following John's lead here. I know when I get stressed, whether it's kind of home or in the office with, you know, when there are clinical situations that kind of demand some kind of action, my reflex, it takes me some time to learn this. I don't know if it's I learned it or if it's my nature, is to slow down, because I think that that's when I know, at least clinically, you can make mistakes when you act reflexively and you don't kind of pay attention to all the information or gather all the information you can get before you do something. It's easy to make a mistake in that setting. I know that Sue, and this is the wife part, when things get stressed and I kind of slow down to think, that's perceived as her as either not caring or not engaging. And I think to some degree, I think her temperament is more common in the world, where when we're in a group of people and we're confronted with something, in some ways, the winner or the person who's perceived as being the most constructive is the one who jumps in first with a solution to say something. And so I think that it's not only our nature, you know, to have a quick reaction, and certainly at some point in our history that was adaptive. But I think we still live in an environment that rewards that. It rewards that quick response, and so it's hard, even when you are wired like me, or you try to learn to kind of slow down and think when you're in those situations. We're still embedded in a culture that really pushes you to you know, to respond quickly.
Well, I think that sometimes slowing down can be the best revenge. In the road rage situation, if somebody is behind me and indicates that he thinks or she thinks I'm going too slow, I usually put my foot on the brake just to annoy them. So I don't do it to think, but it's, I think slowing down can have two meanings. And I can see if you do that to think more, it can be construed as you're just trying to piss me off.
I'm sure that elicits a friendly response from that as well, right?
Well, I think that's how it is perceived by by Sue, and I think by others, is that when you don't respond immediately, it is pursued as like some kind of a passive aggressive thing. And so I think it's hard, even if we personally evolve, to try not to respond reflexively. We're still embedded in a local community that wants to push us the other way, or the person who speaks first, or more loudly with an answer, is often one who gets heard. I'm just about 2/3 of the way listening to a book about introversion called Quiet, and it talks a lot about this. About people who are characterized as introverts often do a lot more thinking and kind of problem solving and illustrating in their head before they speak, and they're often perceived as slower or dumber or not as insightful. And when you live in a world where the loudest person gets heard, or the first person, the first guy in, gets the weight on their side, there's a lot of forces that work against that going slowly and considering things, even if it's a good idea.
Yeah, I want to pull on the thread because I so hear you, Pacey. I think that it is natural to want to, instinctively react. And I know that it's only through doing that and the regret that comes with it that we learn to mediate that behavior and get to a place where let them do what they're going to do, Margaret, because you're just going to drive and, I'll just not going to bother me at it, just kind of learn to mediate that response. I think just comes from maybe responding and having that regret a few times. So I know that, I guess road rage, I live in this kind of rural location and have this very simple life, so I don't have to deal with that too much. But I know for myself, I'm very reactionary. And I had a head injury back in 2001. So I have friends who say, you didn't have many filters before that, and after that, you have absolutely none. So my impulsivity is very huge. But isn't that one of these places where in switching these words around and learning to think about them differently, we come to that self-learning space and learn to take a breath.
I agree.
And be contemplative. And those are my thoughts at the moment. Thank you for listening. I'll return to that.
Thank you.
I sort of see this as sort of tied up into the respect, that there's an element that I'm just thinking in terms of what is it that I react to or react to, that if somebody is like tailing me really close, in a sense, it's, it bothers me and I want to slam on the brakes, as Sharrett does too. I know that he's guilty of that because he followed me one day and was way, way behind me because somebody was tailgating him. But what element is it? Is it just, what is it that makes me angry or quirks me off? It's, in a sense, it's kind of a respect thing. It's, it's disrespectful to, to tailgate me or drive close. Or, if I'm talking and somebody cuts me off before I finish saying things, as being kind of a slower speaking person, it's frustrating, and I kind of react to that kind of thing. And I guess the angle that I'm suggesting to this is, what is it that actually causes the impulsivity? And I think an element of it is tied into if you feel like you're being disrespected in some way or belittled in some way.
I think Marilyn, you're on mute.
Marilyn, you have to unmute yourself.
I said there's some feedback going on. I'm not sure. I'd muted myself. I thought maybe it was me.
Well, if you're not speaking, it'd be a good idea if you mute yourself. We say that to everyone. If you're not speaking, just put yourself on mute because we do get feedback. Probably here.
Yeah.
One thing I try to do that helped me, at least in the, when people are being unpleasant or aggressive or following me or too close, is to remember that and it's hard to remember that we're all in different places on different trajectories, but our paths happen to be crossing at that moment. So if someone's behind me and they're tailgating me, I try to think, well, do they have someone sick in the car? Or are they on the way to go somewhere that's important? Did something just bad happen? And because I know there are times when I'm, a less than optimal driver, if I'm in a crap mood or, I'm late and, I got to work and I forgot my phone. So I'm driving home to rush to get back to work so I can start late. And, so I think that recognizing that people are, as we encounter them, people are in different places in their own trajectories. And I know that I would want to be cut some slack if I'm following someone too close, and if I'm behind you, Mom, and you're slowing down, as I drove by to give you the finger, I would say, lady, don't you know that I'm late for the office and I've got a real sickie waiting for me? You're gonna. But it's I think the appreciation that people are in other places, when our trajectories cross, people are in very different places that you really can't know. Often even talking to people, as I talk to people in the office, they come in, they're well dressed and they look comfortable, and you close the door and sit down, and the lady says, well, the divorce is going terrible. They're taking my stuff, and my 20-year-old is just back in the hospital again with his congenital spinal disease, and he has a terrible infection. But as we cross paths with people during our days, it's really hard to know where people are in their own trajectory. And I think to assume that if people are behaving the way they are, either there may be some reason for that we may behave similarly or not, but either way, it's helpful to recognize that they're not having a good as day as we may be having. And at least that's something that helps me diffuse getting pulled into adversarial situations.
The number of accidents that have happened in Connecticut this year and the number of people who have died is alarming. So early in the year, there are so many advertisements now coming on where they are saying, especially those people who are driving, tailgating, most of them are in a fit of anger or hurry, and bringing it back to what this trend is about, to how to how to replace anxiety and anger with energy. Now, PC, you said if you are late to office, or all of us are when we try to drive fast, and somebody might have some other issues, some emergency. So at that time when we drive, not only we drive fast, not only we create problems for ourselves, but we create a lot of risk for other people who are on the road. Because if somebody like Marilyn or Obi or me, they slow you down, it increases the anger even more. So Obi, I don't know why I did that when I was with you. Most of the times I just get off from their way. I just don't, I just get away from that place. Sometimes it gives some guilty pleasure to piss somebody off on the road, but it does. I remember this one situation which actually changed my life. I was an angry child. I don't know why. I used to get very angry very quickly as a child, and once my brother was having fun at my expense, and I kept on telling him not to trouble me, but he kept on doing it. And in a fit of anger, I had a knife, a pair of scissors. So I just pushed them in his leg. It did not go deep, but he was hurt very badly, and my parents had to take him to hospital. And when, as very aptly said by Don's the video, that later on when we look at it, we realize, right, sometimes we don't get second chances. Fortunately, I hit my brother and not somebody else, so my parents did not go to the police. And I had my brother suffered for 2 years where he could not play. Whenever he used to play, people would, sometimes he would get his leg hurt. It will swell a lot. He faced a lot of problem for 2 years. Thankfully, he's well now. But that event, I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. It really changed me, and I started looking at my anger issues, and I had to work a lot on it. And I am very, very less angry now. So it is very important for us to remember that sometimes these actions we take in a fit of anger or anxiety is not is irreplaceable. So I was listening to that. I was remembering that event.
I've heard of I think of it as a scaling issue. I heard of the people who were in business who were World War II veterans and, saw a lot of death and destruction. And you just sort of saying that, the kinds of things that people worry about, that, that the taxes are due, or that, somebody didn't come to work on time, or, that would normally maybe bother a lot of people. And the concept was that people who went through World War II, they just weren't quite as bothered. That, sort of after seeing their friends die on the battlefield and being thankful that they came back where they knew other people didn't, that, the stuff that happened on a daily basis just really wasn't that, it just didn't really register that terribly important, and they didn't get too terribly upset about it. I think just weren't sort of being satisfied that, they were there and living and surviving. And I just think of that as a scaling, with all of these things that you can get upset about, and does it really matter? I guess if you've been in situations where things really did matter quite a bit, that things like somebody cutting you off, it's annoying, but it just isn't that important in light of other things that you've seen that are maybe more more important in terms of survival and living.
I was driving with my wife a while back, and I've said this story a while back, but I just repeat it here, that we stopped at a light, and a car pulled up next to us. A young fellow in the car rolled down his window, and he yelled out to us. He said, "You almost touched my car before. If you would have touched my car, I would have had to hurt you. I want you to know that." So I mean, he was a young punk, and he was just, it's part of the street kind of a attitude, I guess. But I think what we're sharing here is how easy it is that when we react pretty quickly, we develop something called escalation. When one person does something that offends another, you react, and then that person has to react, and before you know it, it built up, and that's why we have wars. Usually wars don't start with the first incident, but they build up over a period of time, and then we start justifying why the other person is worthless and deserves to have punishment. So I think this is one of the issues that, when we realize that we're all built this way. I think Einstein's brilliance was to say, when he said we must teach ourselves a newer way of thinking, he was really saying we're addicted to a way of thinking. We're born with 1 billion years of preparation where we have this fight or flight response as a normal reaction. And it's going to continue. And now that we've introduced weapons that offer no second chance, we can't, as like Sharad said, with his, fortunately, and if you want to call it fortunate, was his brother. He didn't get called by the police or whatever because his mother didn't report him and so on. But what happens is that things escalate over a period of time, and until usually there's an event and often a war, and then somebody wins and somebody loses. The message we're getting today is that if somebody pushes the button, it's all over. There is no winner and losers. They're just losers, and that's part of the difficulty we're facing. So I just want to relate this a moment to our Genie Seminar, if I might. If indeed, as Einstein is right, that we are addicted to a way of thinking, that we're born with this fight or flight response, and unless we educate ourselves differently, it's only a matter of time before we get more and more escalation. That we've got to find ourselves a way using problem solving or directing energy for our mental energy to problem solving, rather physical energy, which is fight or flight, which is the way we're instinctively designed. So the idea of the Genie group is, we've said, is important for lifelong education. We don't change the way we've been addicted to something suddenly. We need to have continual support to keep ourselves in line. I've learned this working with heroin users. If you don't give them support over the period of their lifetime, they easily revert back to the old way of doing things. And the likelihood is, unless we have lifelong support in Genie groups, these go on over a period of time. I think that's the real value of meeting on a regular basis, you see. And it takes time. We don't expect that we're going to change the way we've been thinking by a few meetings. It's when we have mutually supportive meetings over a period of time. We've been talking in the past, as Josephine brought it up, we had a message that she couldn't be here today because she's visiting her daughter. But one of the things people ask, that we get her comment that she made the last time, that she's beginning to realize the importance to take action and to start, really taking things a little bit more seriously. But unless we change our way of doing things, and I just wanted to share my way of dealing with it. I've learned to deal with the stress. I've learned as a psychiatrist that fantasy, one of the things we have is the ability to think, and we use fantasy. So fantasy can be a preparation for action, but it can also be a substitute for action. So what I've learned is when somebody pulls in front of me and I feel that instinctive reaction, I say in my fantasy, I can actually kill the person in my fantasy. I think of myself my car turns into a tank, and I run the car over and they flatten them out like you see in the old cartoons, the Roadrunner cartoons. And, the person, well, I've really taught him a lesson, and he even says thank you as he comes back to life, because in the old cartoons, that's what happens. Because in your fantasy, we can do anything we want, and we can get satisfaction. So think about it. Fantasy can be a substitute for action. So it gets us out of trouble if we think in terms of what we could do and smile and laugh about how successful I was in teaching this person a lesson. And then I come back to real life and say, I realize that if I were to pull the car over and say, let's fight, or put my finger at that person and we start shouting at one another and it escalates, that's not going to get me what I want. So the bottom line is that we can ask ourselves regularly, what would I like to happen when I realize that I'm getting frustrated and I'm getting overheated and so on. And when I ask this question, what would I like to happen in the long term, it really gives me an opportunity to use my rational thinking in terms of short and long term. So that's something that I found. Fantasy can be and really very helpful as a substitute for action. If you can learn to smile as you do your deeds, you kill the person or whatever, strangle them. Think of all the horrible things we can do to teach people a lesson. But we can do it in our fantasy, and then go ahead and say, what's the most appropriate thing to do to get me what I want short term and long term. I'm complete here.
One thing I remember is, I'm not even sure if Basu, you remember this now, but Basu and I were together in college, and once we had a fight. I don't remember the reason for fighting, but obviously it was a fit of anger that we both said some very beautiful things about each other, which cannot be repeated. And we just stopped talking to each other. I think it was for a week or two that we did not talk. We used to live next to each other, like his room was next to mine. And there was this friend of mine who took a lot of advantage of that. He would go to Basu, say things about me, and then come to me and say things about Basu. And then he tried to take a lot of advantage, like not in a bad way, but in a good way. Like so sometimes what happens is, when not only sometimes, like almost all the times, anger and anxiety, when they convert into some action, more often than not, that action does not give us the value, any return of value for the action that we have taken. So I learned two very good things today in this meeting. One is what Pacey said, because I am a very I do a lot of things very quickly. So I will try to slow down when I have anxiety or anger. And secondly, I will try to fantasize more. From Don.
There is, I think what you bring up, I think illustrates something else, is that many people are uncomfortable with an unresolved problem or an unresolved confrontation. I think much of the hurry to get things resolved is for people to reduce their own anxiety, in the moment, and that gets, what's best for you and me now and in the future kind of thing. When people have that sense of urgency or emergency and they just want to do something to relieve themselves, I think we're not very good at living with uncertainty or threat or a kind of perceived threat. So I think there's something about, maybe how do we get there from here? How do we get to a place where people don't react so quickly or destructively or aggressively? Some of it may have to do with training people that it doesn't have to be resolved right now. I know we talk about the notion of, well, in our head, let's call it an urgency and not an emergency. But if you have that fight or flight feeling in your guts, right in that moment when someone's tailgating you, very hard not to want to just rid yourself of that. And you can often do that by being aggressive or doing something that may not be very destructive. I'm not sure how you, from a workshop point of view or an experience, how you train people to be able to exist in that kind of uncomfortable space and not resolve it.
So it's a related but slightly different thing which I experienced. Generally, I don't get angry with my employees or shout at them. Generally, they are always happy and having a lot of fun. But then when some work is not getting done or it's getting delayed, then so recently I got a little angry and shouted at a few of them, and then that my anger resulted in a lot of energy with the other employees. So, so it was a different transfer of energy. So, because I was angry, they were a lot of, they were working late and getting a lot of things done faster.
The same thing happened with me. I'm leading a team here of guys, and with another, there are two of us who are leading the team in a Scrum team, and generally I try to help everyone. Anyone, and I try to accommodate their feelings. But we are at a time when mistakes cannot happen, and we cannot allow any mistakes to happen, or especially in communication, which is, I think, the biggest problem in the world forever. Like people don't communicate, or they don't communicate on time. So in a global delivery model, we have, when we transfer work from here to some other country, and from there they need to give us some kind of feedback the next day, so that the work continues. It doesn't stop when we stop working. There was an issue like this where, despite requesting several times, people were just not doing it, and so I became really upset. And it was not whatever I said in the fit of rage was more of an acting rather than I really, I was knowingly. I'm also a fun-loving guy at office. Everybody knows me as a guy who makes jokes, but I said some things, and I told that I requested everyone. I was just in a louder voice that if this goes outside this group of people, then everybody will be called out, and then you'll have to face much more problems. So some people later on came and told me that they were really surprised that I would use a higher tone of voice. And then I apologized to them. But at the end of the day, from next day, things started working really well.
I think this brings up an interesting concept of, you sort of reinforce what's effective. In certain work environments, you yell at somebody, you're short with somebody, you're showing them that, you mean business and there's going to be repercussions. That motivates people to action. And in a sense, it sort of reinforces the opposite of what we're talking about here.
No, there are two things, Obi. It's not that, at least in my case, it is, if I was not helping out everyone and giving directions and doing the, like, creating new processes to communicate, and just using the anger, it would not work. So what I told them is, see, we are doing together these things. I was not exactly like shouting at folks. It's just that because of my personality, like I always make jokes, I talk about like their life, and apart from work, I talk about a lot of stuff. They were really, surprised that I used it. But you are right. Again, it cannot be, in my view, this is a weapon which has to be used once in a while. If somebody is angry on a daily basis, it will not work, because people will stop taking you seriously. Then it has to be once in a while, and only when it is needed. And that too, to a certain extent, we cannot go and start, at least in my view, we cannot go and start shouting and demeaning people. It's just, a change of tone of voice sometimes works. I realized later on that maybe I could have used something else, a better way to communicate. So I apologize to everyone.
Hey everybody, it's Josephine. I joined a little late, so sorry, but I've been listening.
Hey, Josephine.
Hey,
Welcome.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I'm late. I had some family visiting. There was a comment a little while ago about, how do you, if you're confronted, how do you remain calm, or, how do you not react? I went to the African American Museum, I don't know, maybe not even a year ago, around when it first opened. And then there's this whole exhibit, as if you're sitting at the lunch counter where those young students sat and had to face all of the insults because they were being asked to leave. And the way the exhibit is set up is as if you were sitting at the counter. And it turns out the people who were selected to sit at the counter had gone through, I wouldn't say training, but they'd practiced before they were there, before they were selected to be the students to sit there. And the way the exhibit shows you is kind of based on your personality type, whether or not you would be selected to sit at that lunch counter, right? Because you had to, take a lot of insults, sometimes, assaults on your body, and, if you had to not react. You had to be able to understand what you were doing and why you were sitting there was so much more important than reacting to that person. Sad to say, I took the quiz and I would not be selected to sit at the counter. My reactions were not such. But there is a way, if we do these mind changes, I think we can train ourselves to not be as reactive, even when someone is tailgating.
I ran into I'm thinking of this tailgating thing that I was in China a few years back in in Beijing, China, which has horrendous traffic and lots of opportunities for road rage, and was within a professional driver, and I was just amazed at how calm and passive this person was as we were just driving through the city very, very slowly. And I remember I commented to him, I said, wow, look, you must have such a personality to so that this doesn't bother you. And he looked at me and says, oh, no. He says, I spent years being horribly upset and terribly frustrated, hour after hour. And I just decided it just wasn't worth being horribly upset and terribly frustrated all the time. So he I had thought that this was an evolved person here who didn't get upset. And it turned out that he went through the same thing that the rest of us did. It's just that, he kind of learned to adapt to it, or to not let it get under his skin. And, his day seemed to run a lot smoother, or at least he didn't seem to be upset all the time. So I offer that as just a case in this where somebody did sort of make that word switch, or did adapt constructively.
I wonder, he's someone, he does it full time every day. It took him years to do it. How viable is it to for us to tell ourselves that we can do this just cognitively? Or how viable would it be for that taxi driver to tell the new guy who just joined the taxi force, just don't let it bug you? And I wonder about how you get from where we are to where we'd like to be. And I think there is an element of time and practice that goes into kind of cognitive evolution and certainly behavioral change. And I wonder what we're doing or what's part of the program to facilitate that, or if other people buy into the fact that there's time and practice required to make that change happen.
I think there's an element of just having the conversation. You know, there's an element of, if you're in a situation where somebody's in your face, you know, just the idea of it, you know, maybe there is another way to look at this. And it sort of starts from just a seed that you even contemplate that there's a way. You might not do it right away, but just by the act that, you know, we have some of these meetings and stuff, you think in those terms. At least it becomes a possibility. I wouldn't say it's a habit necessarily, something to do, but it's a starting point. You know, just sort of, it's the first step. Compared to being a balanced person, you probably won't get there. But compared to saying, at least I didn't even have the thought, you know, I just want to lunge at somebody. That is the first step. Maybe that's the kind of where it starts from.
I was interested in what Josephine said about this lunch counter role-playing sort of thing, that evidently somebody's thought about writing a script or something to give to the hecklers. And if you put that in maybe a high school setting or a setting of even with younger children, about putting them in a setting where people are baiting them and trying to get them upset, and then try to give them ways of dealing with that. I think that's a really interesting model, and to see how, if you've really never been in that situation, to see how you would react and how you can sort of tone things down. Josephine, did you watch when people were put in that situation?
Well, it was photographs, right? It wasn't film. It was photographs, and you kind of sit at the lunch counter and you go from seat to seat, and you can see, and they ask you different questions. You know, basically, if a person comes over and is screaming in your face, what's your natural reaction? Or if you're pushed, you know, how do you react? And it gives you, you know, theoretic situations, and based on your responses, it tells you kind of what you would need to work on before you would have been selected to sit at the counter. Like your personality kind of type is not the right personality type because it's too reactive. And what they were teaching you was, you know, the reaction that you were going to have, which might be your first response to get angry, you know, and lash out, is not going to get you to end game. And it's not what they were trying to do. You need to be able to know how to control yourself. So it was more about self-discipline and control and understanding the bigger picture. But I like your idea about, you know, high schoolers and giving them different situations and understanding, you know, how they would react, and then have them think through how they would react, whether or not the outcome is going to get them to where they want to be.
And Kate wants to pull in thread a little bit, just and the reactivity. We were talking about this impulsive nature that we're going to be reactive, and then as far as educating, I think many people are at a place where they realize the flight or flight reaction is, you know, evolutionary, animalistic, if you will, and that we are at a place where we can, you know, reframe that. That's where the education comes, though, is that it's possible to reframe those animalistic behaviors. And, you know, I've thought of this proverb that he who smiles rather than rages is always the stronger, you know, has come to me a couple of times. I spent most of my life as a Western registered nurse, and you only have to see people in their reactionary places for a while before you realize and I think it's kind of going on something Pacey was saying, if we understood the scars of another man's heart, if we realized that, we would all see how blessed we are. And, that everybody's, whether you want to say everybody's got some kind of battle going on or whatever, I think that when you can get to that place and understand, don't know where they're at, not sure where they're coming from in this moment, everybody's doing the best they can, usually with what they know. But when we can educate and reframe and teach that it is possible to change these places that you react in. I'm probably talking a lot, and I will return the feather. Thank you for listening to that thought.
The philosopher Epictetus was a slave. And one of his important teachings was he said that only the educated are free. In other words, we're all born slaves. We're born with 1 billion years of prior programming with an animal brain that tells us that we react. We react with fight or flight, that fear and anxiety and anger are normal in a primitive environment. You have to have these responses in order to survive, because every turn of the corner is a life-threatening situation. But it's no longer necessary in today's relatively civilized world, but unless we educate ourselves that way. And that education doesn't happen in 1 or 2 meetings. It takes a long time to change an addiction. So if we're born addicted, we're born as slaves, really. We're slaves to the prayer program we've originally had. I'm thinking of the Robinson story, the baseball story, the first black man to be introduced to baseball. And if you watch the movie or the story, how they spent a long time, before they picked Jackie Robinson, and spent a lot of time with them saying, when people call you nigger and they call you names and so on, how are you going to react to that? So just what we've been talking about took a lot of education and training. And he really became a role model of how to deal with prejudice and bias and so on. And so he became the hero, but it took education. And I think if we look at ourselves in our meetings, if we can only be honest to say, we are still addicted ourselves to this red alert fight or flight response, and it's not something we can easily just pass off. It's going to take a long time to re-educate ourselves in a different way of thinking. That was Einstein's message. And in order to learn these 7 word switches, we've had just 1 round of this, but most of the science says that unless you do this at least for 30 days for half an hour, and you work on these word switches, they don't stick. The instinct we're born with is very powerful, and it starts with ourselves. As we've said, the basic issue is you learn to love yourself with the abundance that overflows to enrich the world. So we need to spend a lot of time with these basic issues of learning, what's good, the basic love creation skills that are all part of the 7+2 formula. But we think that just an intellectual comment or understanding is all it takes. It's not so. We really are addicted to a way of thinking that is more addictive than heroin addiction. We know how hard it is to get rid of a drug habit. Well, I think it's even more difficult to get rid of a thinking habit. And I just want to mention that when I had a conversation recently with Neil Donald Walsh, and he gave me the new title to a book that's in progress, and he said, you need a new title, and the title he offered was Ending the Thought Addiction Before It Kills You. Ending our thought addiction before it kills you. And then he added a subtitle, The Addiction That You Don't Know That You Have. We're getting at the end of our time, and we're going to ask for last comments. So anyone would like to make comments, please do so.
One thing, I think listening, reaction seems to be ignorant, whereas action is more deliberate. And I'm learning not to be ignorant. Let me put it that way. I'm learning not to be ignorant. When I hear things or I see things, I think about not reacting. But if I were going to perform an action deliberately, what would that action be?
Yep.
And I try to make sure that that action is going to lead to the most positive outcome. So if I take nothing away, if I never join these calls ever again, which I'm not saying I won't, I'm saying that's what I would absolutely take away.
Yep.
Well, I'll close our meeting then with a comment from Norman Vincent Peale, one of the first early positive thinking individuals, a clergyman from New York. And his comment was, I realize that when I get up every morning, I have a choice. I can make myself happy or I can make myself miserable. Really, the way I think, I can make myself happy or I can make myself miserable. And then he concluded by saying, you know, I'm not a fool. So we know that the choices we have. So thank you all for your sharing. And Kate, if you care to continue our meetings, you'll have to get me your email so we can include you in our invitations. Other than that, we'll end our meeting and we'll continue for those who are working on our World Peace Project. So see you all next week. And I would encourage you to review the recordings of 7+2 formula, especially if you're new, Kate. Just take a little time. And they all have these simple word switches. If you practice them long enough, they do elevate the capital of our attentions from our animal brain, which says what's good for me for now, here and now, to our Genie puzzle solving brain, which can say what's good for me and you for now and the future, which is quite a big difference. So lots of love to everybody, and we'll see you next Sunday, hopefully.
See you next week.
Bye-bye. See you
Bye-bye.
next week. So long.
Bye.
Bye.